And what about, I'm also curious to know about what you think about this idea of documentary films that act as a kind of intervention. So like the Jean Rouge one that we saw, the Human Pyramid, that was this idea that he could make this kind of social experiment and film that, and that would change how this group of teenagers thought about racial relations, right? And if you've seen some of Jaromir Žilnik's films, some of them are this kind of docu-fiction mode, and then there are others that are very much also this kind of intervention, like senzorni film, where he's inviting a group of homeless men into his home for a few days and filming that, and then using that to raise these questions. Did anybody have thoughts about that? Do any of you think that you would be willing to try something like that, or have ideas of what kind of a sort of social experiment you could do that would be interesting and provocative, but not super dangerous to people's mental health? Or
I wanted to ask, not about this, but I wanted to make, my idea was to make something like with young people, maybe music scene in nightlife in Zagreb. But I don't know, would that be an ethnographic film, because it's not a specific group of people, it's more like young people that go out and go to more underground music scene, maybe not for famous bands, but our bands, like our young people. Like I have a friend in school who just started a band, and he actually performed before a famous group here. And maybe, I don't know how to present that, like is that a group, the people who just go to those maybe more local concerts?
What do other people think?
Yeah, that's still a specific group of people, some culture.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, you're capturing a group, like they see themselves as a group for one thing, and they have you're capturing something about their kind of habits, and it happens to be like their habits of going out, and you're interested in questions surrounding that, and you want to capture that. So it sounds absolutely ethnographic to me. And
but if I film that, should I film concerts too, or just like them going to concert? Like I don't know what to film. Like there is so much that I could tell about them. I don't know if everything would make sense together,
Okay. I mean, you can approach it in different ways, right? So it depends what's interesting to you, and you can also be thinking about what will be interesting to show through a film. So what's interesting to you about this group?
Well, it's more with how they are all individuals, but they find this specific thing that they all like, and they have it's like a subculture. They have similar dress styles. I don't know, they usually hang out in similar places. So I guess I would like to show that part of them. Like how they come together for this and have similarities, but still they're not the same people.
So maybe you would also be interested in looking at sort of what's their life like when they're not part of this group? How are they as individuals, and how are they together? Or?
Yeah, I think my friend would maybe help me with that, because I know him, so I guess he would allow me to film.
Yeah. And what's nice about focusing on a kind of small group like that is if you're spending time with them, then you can become more kind of intimate, and they can become more comfortable with you, and you can get shots that are probably more interesting and natural than if you're going to a big concert and just shooting some random people.
Yeah, the big concerts, like, yes, there would be people that are stereotypical for that concert, for that kind of music, but I think it would be too different, too many kinds of people there to actually represent one group. It would just be common people, let's say.
Yeah. No, and I think what's nice about a kind of fan subculture that relates to ideas from anthropology is, in anthropology a lot of times we'll read things by like Emil Durkheim about this idea of collective effervescence and what happens when people become a part of a group and take part in something that feels larger than what they are as individuals. And whenever I read that with my students and I ask them to think about a time when they felt something of that kind of like a special group energy, a lot of times it's concerts and it's music concerts that they can think of where there's kind of something, there's something in the air that's a little bit different and special than sort of everyday life, that sort of takes them outside of who they are as everyday individuals. So it can be interesting to try to capture that feeling on the camera. So yeah. Okay. Anybody else have? Yeah.
I was thinking about your question. In general, I think that documentary filmmaking is a very slippery slope because usually, I mean, obviously, the most interesting subjects are the ones that are maybe controversial or somehow difficult, and I think it's very hard to balance between showing something and hoping that the person or people around who it is centered around won't feel exploited in the end. I know some documentary filmmakers who really advocate raising tensions because they then think it will make for a more interesting situation to film. And obviously you can do that, but it's also intervention. I mean, just being there is an intervention. So yes, how do we make an ethical film or ethical documentary photography? We document what is going on, but we try to stay away from it. It's very, I think it's very slippery slope to do that. And there was actually, you mentioned Jilnik, who documented homeless people. It reminded me of a person who had this, in Croatia, who had this show. He called, so the show was, he was the host, but other people who were regular guests, who were also kind of hosts, were people from margins, of societal margins. And it was a very good way, it was pretty vulgar a lot of time, but it was a very good way of giving those people a platform, and they really felt like they didn't feel used. They felt, yes, this is us, and we are talking. It could be very vulgar, it could be very funny, it could be very sad, but it was always them. I think I went a little far now, but what I'm trying to say, yes, it's a very slippery slope between, yes, we are documenting something, and then we are using that to show someone, but that won't necessarily change your circumstances.
Yeah. Does somebody have something that they wanted to respond to that, or thoughts or ideas about how to handle that, or how to mitigate that, how to?
Well, I guess you have to first of all have a consent from those people what you will do, and they need to fully understand what they're going to do for this film. And if they agree, I think it's not problematic, I guess. Because like we saw that movie, I forgot which one was it, but where they act out little parts of their lives that maybe don't happen anymore, but it was in their culture.
Okay. Yeah.
Like we need to preserve that. So maybe that was the only way, but we should have a disclaimer before maybe how this is acted out and not they're currently not living like this. So we know.
Yeah, something that makes that aspect of it more transparent. Or I mean, something else that Jean-Luc does in Chronicle of a Summer, which probably many of you have seen, so I didn't show that one. But there's this moment where he collects all this footage. He has a cut of his film, and then he shows it to the people who are in it, and then he films the discussion that they're having, right? And so you can think about. And I was meeting with someone this week about a project that I want to do later, kind of collaborative media making project, and she gave me this nice advice that consent shouldn't just be something that happens at the very beginning and then it's over, but it shouldn't be just a piece of paper that you sign at the beginning, but that's part of the process. And that's something with my research with you guys, for example. At any moment, if you decide like, oh, I don't want to be part of this research project, you can drop out of it. And so that there can be more of this kind of a constant feedback between the people you're working with and filming until the finished product is made. One thing that can be tricky with that is if you're working with people who maybe don't have a lot of time, and so that maybe they're okay with being filmed while they're doing something, but they don't necessarily want to sit down with you a million times and help you edit it. So you also have to be kind of flexible with that, but you can have conversation up front about like, what can this relationship look like, what do you want it to look like, and sort of see what works best for them depending on their circumstances and their interests in it, right? So that it doesn't have to be something that you just agree to up front and then they feel like they need to go along with it because they said that they would help you. Let's go ahead and we'll start talking about the material for today. So last week we talked about this kind of border between ethnography and fiction that has always been there, this kind of the ways in which people like Flaherty were always making these kind of artistic documentaries, that there was something artificial about them. And today we're going to look, the first couple of people whose films we'll look at were a little bit more oriented towards the idea that the camera can be used as more of a kind of scientific tool for us to study human behavior as anthropologists, and so that it can be this important tool. And in general, I think the question that the people we're looking at today are trying to answer is, how can the camera do something that writing can't do, that language can't do, and how does the camera capture elements of life that are unspoken, basically. So the first question I had was that you can maybe discuss in small groups, and then we can discuss together, is so we talked about, so I'll just back up. We talked in the first week, somebody had a definition of ethnographic film, that it's a film that is made using ethnographic methods, right? And what would be some of those ethnographic methods?
Observing.
Okay, so participant observation is a kind of classic thing of what is an ethnographic method. Say more about what does that involve?
You observe and participate.
Okay. Does anybody have an example of an ethnographic work that they read where, like, what's the participation element of an example that you can think of?
Doing some ordinary things with the people that you are researching.
Okay.
And spend some time with them, be part of their life activities, everyday activities, and so on.
Okay. Yeah, and in some ways, I think that this idea of participant observation is already making a kind of implicit argument that there are things that you can't get through language, because we could just go into a community and do an interview with people, but participant observation is already assuming that there's something that we can't get from an interview, that we have to sort of try out or be part of people's lives in order to get what it's like to be in that community, right? How about in groups? I want you to discuss a time when you were in a community that was different and you found yourself doing something that was different and unusual. And how did you need to, what was that thing that you needed to sort of experience and become a part of in order to understand it? Okay, so think of a time when you were in a sort of a different kind of community first than what you were used to, and then try to think of an activity where you felt like, oh, okay, I have to figure out this like different way of doing something. And what was something you noticed about that? Okay?
It's entirely my fault. Sorry about that.
Okay. Yeah, does that make sense? Okay.
I suppose so, s ljudima je tako isto nam živopismi glazla, tako da ono mislim da je Da.
To inače napravio
ono da se inače ne bi tako ono što ljudima koji zapravo ne pozna, nego ono koji se samo dobro. Ovo inače da, pa nego da se...
Jer mislim da obično ako to radi, onda nema mogućnost pojačiti ovdje radi.
Nema drugog načina nego da se da upotrebimo svaki mogući i nemogući znak da prokomuniciramo. Tako da svaki tjedan upravo ono nalazimo kada se recimo nađeš sve što mogu i prilagoditi se na koji god način. To je moj čovjek. Da, ne bi nikad to napravila sama, ali mislim to je jedna od ideja.
Nije samo ti. Ali ne bi trebalo biti.
Recimo da je to neki primjer nečega što gdje se onako kako ću prikazati skupinu.
Da, jasno.
Malo pokušaš poprimiti te njihove bole, barem za to jedan
Now we're discussing a time when you were in a new kind of community and what was an activity that you did where you could sort of feel the difference between kind of cultural difference or whatever based on something that you were doing that was different. If you want to join us,
Mislim da se uopće ne mora
I'm thinking of one and then I will do.
što više i što više
sad samo što neki ljudi to rade na nekoj
da odabereš
većoj
nešto
školi rade, a neki će trajati pa je
da pokriješ 3 priče gdje su
Da, mislila sam da je lakše tako.
Okay, do you have a situation like that?
Zagrebačka alternativa.
Mislim, ja nisam u tome, ali imam prijatelje, čini se zanimljivo.
I gave, for example, a situation where I'm not religious, I don't pray, but it is fairly normal for a lot of people in Greece to pray before lunch. So, for example, if I'm at someone's house and they start praying, I'm going to pray with them for lunch. Or if it's someone's birthday, there's a lot of people and they say before each and will pray, I will respect that. I told him I will be some kind of a chameleon because you don't want to insult and also you want to blend in for that lunch. Yeah, so that's kind of, that's some
različito značenje
maybe
iza toga
banal, but everyday
u određenim okolnostima, tako da to bi sve htjela.
How about you? Well, I mean, I was kind of more like, I was talking more about like my experience in ethnography, because I did like this whole kind of, for one semester I did this ethnography, like a karaoke club here in Zagreb, and I kind of went there, you know, a couple times a week, and I kind of got to know all these people, so there was also this kind of like, this kind of moment of like participation where I would like get on stage and, you know, sing with people who I don't know and stuff, just kind of to kind of, I guess, you know, participate in the whole thing. Like,
malo je to teško kod nas, ne znam.
For you, what was
Malo je jako teško, da,
thing that was really out of your comfort zone? Well, I think just kind of interacting with you, just kind of like performing with, you know, strangers, really, that I kind of,
Okay, so you
not specifically, just like kind of,
interpersonal space to...
Aha, što je
was like, I lived my life in France and the other half in Lebanon and Middle East. So obviously the culture are really different, and blending in and going back and forth to both countries was special in terms of like you take things from, for example, the experience in Lebanon, which was very was, for example, the situation with Palestinian people, which is in Europe very talk much about it, but when you talk, don't be taboo. So when I go to France with this new idea, is how can I respect, you know? Same thing for France. Going back in Lebanon with new ideas of, you know, France and Euro culture. So that was for me the most disorienting. Yeah, well, I imagine because like, just like kind of the cultural differences like so kind of huge, and just like, but it's very interesting then because you have a global eye, you understand what. Yeah.
Okay, maybe I want to hear some of your examples that you discussed. Did anyone have an example of something where they were in a new community or something like a new culture, something that they were doing that they noticed that they were doing differently from other people, or just an example of when you found yourself in a new community, in a new environment?
Well, I gave an example. For example, in Croatia, it's not unusual for a lot of people to pray before lunch, which I never do personally. But if I'm at someone's house, I will do it without really thinking about it, just so to blend in for that lunch and not to insult the person who invited me. So that's a banal example, but I think something that we do a lot in our everyday life.
Yeah, and I think the banal examples are really great because as Maya discussed yesterday regarding her home footage thing, you know, there's this idea that sort of it's the everyday aspects of life that we don't necessarily, that we take for granted, that we don't think about as being, they're sort of, it's natural to us, and sometimes it means going to a different community, even if that's a different family, to notice that, oh, that's not the way everyone does it. And it can be this interesting kind of mirror onto ourselves as well, to think about, okay, why doesn't my family pray? What does that mean, right? Anybody else have an example that they thought of?
I was within the same group. I was telling them I live half of my life in France and the other half in Middle East, Lebanon specifically. So it's more of a global thing to adapt within the country to its own culture. For example, in France, it's normal to go when you're invited in a home to go with your shoes. For example, very banal. But in Middle East, for example, there is this idea of like unshoeing yourself and this kind of trying to be as comfortable as you can in your host place in Middle East. Like if they see you like with your clothes, not your clothes, your shoes, it will be weird, you know. They won't say anything, but you know.
Is it also an idea that wearing your shoes indoors is a little bit dirty? That it's cleaner to take your shoes off? Or?
It's a bit like this, and it's also in the culture. Not more. Lebanon is very much cosmopolitan in comparison, for example, to Iraq, where this thing is like almost everywhere. But it's related to like here it's home and there it's outside. Here you are comfortable and there, you know.
Okay.
Simple.
Okay. Yeah. So I think that I think these kind of like these questions of sort of everyday domestic life are also things that we'll see visual anthropologists interested in trying to capture some of those cultural differences on screen that might not even be as simple as like there's a rule about how, okay, we always pray before meals or we always take our shoes off when we come inside, but some that can't even be maybe described as easily. So thinking about comparing unspoken differences, so there was this movement of trying to study nonverbal communication, for example, in the 60s and 70s among anthropologists and sociologists in the US, and people who were interested in thinking about the camera as a tool for sort of capturing that so that we could study it, right? And then we can think about observational cinema also as being interested in the kind of unspoken way of life, but not doing it in this like scientistic way, but rather trying to help the viewer feel somewhat immersed in that life, and that there's a sense that you can do that through film in a special way that you can't do that when you're writing an ethnography. And then some people would argue that this kind of sensory ethnography movement, which is more recent, is an extension of that, is about thinking about how do we use the camera and sound in ways to sort of give the viewer this kind of more immersed feeling of being in a world rather than studying it from a distance.
I just wanted to add also it can be on many levels. It's not just like costumes, you know, it's not just like what you do physically, but also verbally. The way you argument in different cultures is really different. For example, when I come to Europe, this idea, for example, of the Palestinian situation is very different when we talk about it in Middle East, and same goes for Ukraine. Like, it's really different kind of mindset. So also this kind of things deserve an intellectual investigation in order not to give away your personal political point of view, because people might feel restricted, you know. If I go, for example, to Germany and I claim like free Palestine, what the fuck are you doing? They will be a bit like shallow about it because there is this whole Holocaust history. Whereas if I talk about it in Syria, it's, you know, something else. So it's just, I wanted to add, it's beyond also this work of habits. It's also political most of the time.
Yeah, and I mean something that that certain sociologists and linguistic anthropologists in the 70s became really interested in were not only the norms of communication, not only surrounding the content of what are people arguing about, but what are some of the norms of turn taking, for example. So when is it, so thinking about cultural differences between who sees it as being perfectly normal to interrupt someone else when they haven't finished speaking, and who sees that as a kind of affront, and that there can be those things that are sort of unspoken rules that we don't think about until we meet someone else who has a very different way of discussing things with us. And there's a kind of film, people who are interested in film are related to that as well, that we'll see today. But first I want to start out with, so how many of you have seen films by Margaret Mead and Gregoryja Batesona before? A couple of you, at least. What do you know about them?
Well, obviously she used it for ethnography as to show other cultures, and she would like voice them, and then Bateson would film it. Although he had a different idea, it was like more, as it says here, art. He wanted it to be like artistic, and she was like, no, it's just science. I mean, it needs to be something that should tell other people how other cultures live.
Yeah.
I mean, they made a few films, quite a few actually.
Yeah.
Loads.
Yeah, and they did a lot of filming in the 30s, and then edited a lot of them and released them decades later in the 50s. And so, and you can see that there's this interest that she has in thinking about the camera as a tool to compare cultures, and she was interested in this in her writing as well, the ways in which we can compare different cultures and use that as a lens to learn something about American culture as well. So she has books about like sex and gender relations in different societies, and one of the points that she's trying to make is to denaturalize this idea that we have of like, this is how men are and this is how women are and this is the way relations have to be. She says, oh no, look, I went and I found these examples where relations are completely different. So this is actually culture, it's not nature. So we can watch some of, and I think something else that's interesting about her is, we might think about there are a lot of anthropologists. There's this kind of gendered division of labor where maybe male anthropologists traditionally were interested in these kind of big political questions of who's running these societies and how do they function and how do they relate to other societies. And she was interested in some of these questions of domestic life as also being relevant to understanding the culture. So here she's looking at something that also we might think of as being more closely connected to psychology as well, this kind of relationship between the mother and the baby. And there are lots of psychologists writing about the kind of natural relations between mothers and babies, and she's showing us here that there's something cultural going on as well, that there's not this kind of universal way that mothers and children have to relate to each other. So we'll watch some of these different examples and discuss them. And we'll hear her famous voiceover. When they were married and then they got divorced, but they stayed friends. And they have a daughter who is also an anthropologist, who's sometimes at the meetings and things.
Down the banks of the Sveučilištu River comes a mother with her own 2 small children, the child of a neighbor she is looking after for the dead, and the small child nurse of the neighbor's child. The mother bathes the neighbor's child first, while the child nurse holds her baby. Notice the way in which she holds the child by one stiff arm, and how the child leans away from this stiff hold. You see the shelf which hangs from the mother's neck, on which a Yatmal child cuts its teeth. Now she is bathing her own little boy, with screaming with rage, holding one arm stiff and tense, which is a characteristic temper tantrum gesture for yet more children. Her own baby is held by the arm while it is quickly dipped in the river. Little children are held when they are bathed. There are sometimes crocodiles in the river. The mother shakes the baby dry, darts up the bank with a group of children. Now we see a second mother coming down, again supporting her child by one arm, as the child leans and slides alone. Here again you see the shell suspended from the mother's neck, shells on which the baby cuts its teeth. And she holds the child firmly, while brisk and businesslike she washes it. Shakes it dry, and a third mother dips her baby in the water of the river. And now we shift to an American bathroom. Instead of the wide river, the narrow confines of a small room. While the mother carefully wipes the child's face on a cloth made specially for the purpose, and seats the child in a large porcelain tub, where she has time to stop and play with him. And in his bath water are not crocodiles that might hurt him, but rubber toys. And he leans towards his mother, and then, when told, plays paddle. And then his mother says, bye-bye, and he waves bye-bye to an appreciative adult audience. Notice the mother's hand, ever watchful, ever hovering around the child, while she still gives him an illusion of independence. Then a swish through the water and out, to be carefully dried in a large towel. And he again plays paddle, remembering the cue he was given before. And then he sucks his washcloth, which American babies tend to do. And holds on to the rod, and his mother gives him thyroid. And goes back to drying him and dressing him. The bath is a long, elaborate process which may take as much as an hour and dominate the whole life of the household for the day. He has to have a diet. And a nightgown. And he is getting tired and cross with all this dressing. He puts his whole fist in his mouth. He has nothing on which to cut his teeth at the moment. Very sleepily, very tired of all the elaborate ceremonies, he is taken off to bed. Only a few years later, there had been changes in the way children were brought up in the United States. There is the same bathtub, and the child still plays with toy animals and bubbles her lips, but see how much more relaxed the mother is because this mother has been allowed to feed her baby when it was hungry and has not had to fit it into the schedules that made the mothers of the 30s anxious. Deeper patterns which relate the child and the mother remain the same. You'll notice even in little things we have a similarity. This little girl also sucks on her washcloth. Waves bye-bye. And plays patty cake with her mother as audience. But the mother can handle her much more happily and freely because the relationship between mother and child has no longer been mediated through strict rules where the clock, instead of the mother and baby together, decided what was to be done. But here again you see this little girl takes an outside object to tease on. Neither a part of her own body nor her mother's, just as the little American boy did. In a modern society like the United States, as we use scientific insight, we change and improve our ways of bringing up children. Nevertheless, the basic cultural emphasis, the way in which the American child is encouraged towards independence and towards action of which its mother is a spectator, remains the same. And now we come to a mountain village in Bali, where Carla, a child of the same age, is standing in a tiny tub perched on a high platform, and his mother is bathing him. You see that his teething things hang around his own neck, a string of beads with a little silver box on it. And when he wishes to bite, he bites on the thing that hangs around his own neck. His mother splashes him, he splashes back. He stands and tests his balance. As he tries to get out, she puts him back again, puts him back, and finally takes him out. Now watch very carefully while he sucks his toe, as she smiles and then stares into vacancy. Then we went next door to watch another baby bathe, and Carla came along with us after his own bath to watch this bath of a much younger baby. This time the youngest child of an older woman, whose oldest child is already a mother herself. Doesn't have quite the inclination to play that the first mother had. But the playfulness is there again, as we see Carver come up and bathe the other baby as he himself was bathed. Stroking the other baby, smiling at the other baby. He splashes the other baby. He plays with the other baby. In this simple act of bathing a child, we see how strong the cultural contrasts are between the playful, teasing but inattentive Balinese mother, the careful, conscientious American mother, and the casual, brisk, matter-of-fact New Guinea mother.
Okay, maybe take a minute to talk in your groups about what you thought about the film, and two things I want you to discuss. One is the voiceover, because Margaret Mead's voiceover is super famous as a kind of classical ethnographic film style. What do you think about it? Does it help draw your attention to things, or does it get in the way? So first her voice, and then the second thing, what about this comparative approach, which she employed quite a bit actually? What's useful about it? What is maybe limiting about it? Okay?
Yeah. Yes, what do you guys think?
What did you think about the voiceover? And what do you think about the
I'm not a naturally organized person, but remarkable, really.
Yeah, I don't know, I think the voiceover, like, just, especially when it came to, like, America, in the 1930s and 1940s, I felt like the voiceover kind of brought attention to things that, like, it's not like that I wouldn't have noticed, but that, like, I'm not sure if they're different, you know, like,
To ne znamo da je zaključno možda.
Ono što želimo da se
pričamo. Da, tu se sad događa i to je to.
Yeah, she also mentioned that the American world is more relaxed because she doesn't have a strict schedule. Wouldn't know if she
we don't have the context to, like,
strict.
At the same time, her voiceover sometimes made me notice things that I wouldn't necessarily notice, not because I think they're insignificant. So she says that mother stares into vacancy.
Yeah, he's just like, oh my god, like, he's holding the baby, and like, she like stays into the camera, right? Because the camera is right here, you know, like.
išla za tim da snima još jedan.
And the near
Nije ono 50 godina.
Da, i kao neka ogromna razlika.
Because I think it has some like, connotations that are like, especially like, it has some connotations, especially where like, in the voice or
Yes,
because it's highly civilized United States, blah blah blah.
Yeah, I'm sure she didn't.
I don't think she meant it.
Yeah, was very appreciative. But sometimes when we say something, we maybe give it more gravitas than what just happened.
Yeah.
And I think that's me.
I think I will be more extreme. For me, it's also interesting to ask the question of why do we film. For me, it's the visual experience here. For this case, was downgraded by her voiceover because it tried to lead us with adjectives and like you said, comparisons that were glorifying and not even in a smart way because now like okay New Guinea it seems extreme, but they're more, for example, I don't know, environment friendly because you don't have a whole like 10 meter square for one baby, you know. So if you are to give adjectives, compare, do it as a wholeness. I don't like any kind of film experiment try to lead us, because for me it's a really interesting thing what you can get out of it without being like you are in this forest. What do you mean?
She's kind of leading you and she's like kind of pointing out things that not necessarily that you wouldn't have noticed, but also like things that you wouldn't have like thought about, or that maybe like even if you would have thought about them differently, like the voiceover kind of leads you into the other direction.
Exactly.
And I have a problem with like this neutrality. Yeah.
And if you've only been talking about the voice, talk about the comparative approach and what you think about that. You've talked about both? Did you talk about both also in the back for a little bit?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. So I'm curious to hear, what did you all think about the use of voiceover here?
Well, I think personally, what we like discussed was that like the voiceover kind of, Margaret Mead, like in the voiceover, she kind of like points things out that like not necessarily that we wouldn't have even like noticed if we were just watching the kind of raw footage without like the without like the voiceover. But also I felt as if like for some reason like the voiceover kind of drew conclusions that perhaps would have been different than the conclusions I would have drawn myself had I just been watching the raw footage without kind of any like without any kind of intervention into the like.
Okay.
Yeah. If I'm making sense.
No, I think so, because on the one hand, she like as things are happening, she's saying, now notice this and and watch this very carefully, which could be helpful, especially because, I don't know, like this copy, it's not great, like it's black and white, it's murky, we don't have sync sound, so we can't hear the baby crying, for example. So maybe it's useful to have a little bit of guidance from her to notice things that we wouldn't pay attention to. But she's also captioning things at the end. She's sort of classifying each of the mothers at the end as, okay, now we see from this that the American mother is careful and attentive, whereas the Balinese mother is playful, and the other one is brisk, right?
But also, like, I'm sorry for interrupting you, but like, this is what we talked about, the whole kind of like thing, you wait for someone else to like stop talking. But I felt like, especially like when she makes the sort of like, makes the kind of the assertion that like, the American mother kind of gives the American mother from the 30s gives like kind of like the child kind of like this sense of like illusory like sense of freedom, and then she's like always there to kind of mediate stuff. And then like in the 40s it's much more, the mother is much more like sort of kind of inattentive, but still kind of like much more playful, much more like free in comparison to the American mother from the 30s. I felt like that was kind of a thing where like the footage to me personally would not have revealed that in the same way as like the voiceover. And also something else we discussed was how like with the footage with the Balinese mother, I think, where she's like holding the child while the child is like biting down on something, and they go like, the mother stares into vacancy or whatever, and it's like I felt like that's like such a weird thing. That's such like a weird kind of thing, like the caption, like kind of to say, because like the mother's, because we're not there, like in front of the mother there's like a camera that's pretty up close, it feels, it feels very like kind of, it like explains the intervention without, if I'm making sense again, I don't know.
Yeah, no, that phrase struck me, I think maybe for the first time this time watching it, thinking about how she doesn't seem to be acknowledging the way that the woman is staring at the camera, and the fact that the camera is in this question of like, to what extent is the camera making them act differently than they would naturally, and she's not being very reflexive about that. What about the other group?
It's a teacher's approach, I would say. She's trying to teach us something. She wants us to come to certain conclusions.
Okay, yeah.
And the difference between the American mother from the 30s and the other one later, I think it's just her wishful thinking. Mm-hmm. There is
this notion of progress and but and that's a great point. I think at this time and among this school of anthropologists, it wasn't about this big theatrical release like Grass, where it's going to be this big money-making hit. It's about how can we use the camera to make something that we use in the classroom to teach anthropology, which is a different goals, right? Yeah.
To add moreover to and my colleague here. The problem I had with this documentary was the judging aspect of it. So, teacher, but bad teacher, because it doesn't describe the things as a wholeness. It describes as her point of view, which is really, for me, a red flag of documentary. And this is for me, I'm a bit extreme, but it's a bit propaganda, because I'm thinking back then, it's not like we have TikTok or Instagram. You can just Google and see how things are from the people perspective, because now they have access to camera. So back then, this is what people on a global level interested in the subject would have with her voiceover. So for me, it's actually very worrying the way she did it. And yeah, I gave the example with the group. Even the new Guinea mother, okay, she's doing such rough thing to her child, but maybe if she did deeper research, she could say, for example, the child is less sick, the child is stronger, maybe it's more environment friendly because you don't need like a 10-meter square bathroom for bathing one children with 1 hour time. So you see, it's not like my problem with the voiceovers, like it comes with like censorship, like she doesn't give us things as wholeness, you know.
Okay, and I think that can be a nice transition to the comparative approach, but go ahead.
We were discussing how the bathing itself, it's the same in all three cultures. It's literally the same. Mm-hmm. The thing that she is talking about is the environment and the relationship between mother and a child. So I wouldn't even call it I don't know, what's the...
Bathing.
Yeah, bathing. Mm-hmm. But everything around it.
The mother's approach.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and there's the fact that in all three cultures, it's the mother who's doing the bathing, which I think we're all sort of taking for granted that's the way it's done, right? But it doesn't have to be. It could be that someone else is doing that bathing, right? So we can think about the ways in which...
actually a neighbor is doing the bathing in the first one because she's bathing.
Oh yeah, she's bathing.
Yeah, because she's bathing the neighbor's child.
You're right. Yeah.
Because
it's still like a mother. Yeah.
Yeah, it's still a mother.
But no, you're right. But yeah, but thinking about this kind of like feminization of labor that we take for granted, or the fact that I'm sure we could find other cultures where grandparents are doing the bathing or something like that. But going back to something that I think it's Amar, right?
Yes.
Yeah. What he was saying about we don't have the whole context of each one. We just get a little snippet. So something that seems like it's effective is you can take a little snippet from everyday life that they're all doing. So it's something that they have in common, and we can compare them. But then what we lose is the kind of larger context of how does that fit into their everyday life and beliefs and other issues. We kind of lose all of that. So that's one thing that, in terms of the benefits and drawbacks of some kind of a comparative approach. Did anybody have anything else to add about this kind of comparative approach, which Margaret Mead did a lot, and we're going to watch another one that also uses a comparative approach, but we don't see it that much in later ethnographies. Okay, let's move on to another one that does, this comparative approach. And this is somebody who is less well known now. He founded this field of kinesics, so he's thinking about nonverbal behavior, unspoken behavior, gesture, things like that. Has anyone seen this film before? Okay, so the idea that he had, and he was somebody, he started out, I think, as a student of Mead and Bateson's, and was watching some of these films that they had made, but was really interested in things that they hadn't even noticed before about those. He's like, look what's going on here after she takes him out of the bathtub. And he was really interested in studying really kind of minute aspects of ways in which people communicate with each other without words. And so that's the idea of this film, Microcultural Incidents in 10 Zoos. I think the theme of the zoo is interesting because we talked about it at the beginning in the first film where we talked about, Amar said that some of the films, it was like watching people in a zoo in terms of the ways in which certain ethnographic films really make a spectacle of cultural difference, right? And then we watched A Couple in a Cage that was this kind of satirizing of that. And here we have people going to the zoo and he's studying that, but he's studying the people who are at the zoo and not the animals themselves. So we'll watch the first part of that. So he's looking at people at the zoo in different parts of the world. And I want you again to pay attention. He has a different style of narration and see what you think of his style. What's interesting about this? Is it interesting to you, or is it equally problematic or problematic in different ways?
The film is a shortcut and a labor-saving device for the teacher.
So, and again, he's interested in using this in the classroom. So here he says the film is a shortcut and a labor-saving device for the teacher because you can show things that it's difficult to explain.
I think nothing is less true. The teacher who plans to use audiovisual devices for other than inducing sleep or in getting past an hour needs probably to do more homework on a piece of film or a piece of tape than he does if he's done his own abstraction and is presenting students with abstraction. I want to take a series of pieces of behavior which are chosen by what we call the context control method. The context control method means that as far as possible, we're going to take you cross-culturally in 10 zoos. In the film, whenever possible, we had a mother, a father, and children. We learned how to abstract these particular pieces, and it is based not on random shooting, but on purposive shooting, on examining repetitive structure, and then filming situations over a period of time from which these abstractions can be made. You will go from London to Paris to Rome to Madras to Mysore. India on film is so complicated that I nearly went crazy. For those my friends here in the audience who work in India, God bless you. It is so culturally mixed up on a piece of film that I found myself tearing my hair, and we jumped to Tokyo quickly, to Hong Kong, and then Tokyo, and then finally to the United States. We want to start out in London. We will follow a family into the zoo. I want you to watch the father. It's a very characteristic scene. Father remaining back there. Here comes the father. The children dance around them, and we saw numbers of these instances. Father is carrying the food in a basket. Father is now going to engage in a very typical scene that we saw in the English zoo of absolute certainty on the part of the male, usually the oldest male, that he can interact and have communication with one of the animals. You will discover father now in the presence of his admiring children talking to an owl.
An owl.
He's saying to the owl, and the owl answers. Mother says, isn't that dear? I'm working as a decoy while Mr. Van Vleck is filming. Now we're going to switch now to the receptoscope and watch this scene. I think that one of the things that's particularly important in these scenes, which we noticed in the British zoos, was the absence of self-consciousness on the part of the major actors. For those who are looking for further generalizations, which we found brothers operating, the elder brother took the place of the father and played this particular role as a kind of interaction. And the younger brother stood around in very much the same order of involvement and delight, as we see here. We're now going to move over and begin a series of scenes with relationship to the elephant. Father is going to feed.
Elephant, not elephant.
He's already fed one, and what he's going to do is to talk to the second, to the greedy elephant. And he's going to say to him, fair play, fair play. Insisting that he be fed in turn. He will now watch him bow to the elephant as he leaves. We're going to move now to Paris. The characteristic thing that we saw in the Paris Zoo of this nature was the relationship between the parent and the child and the animal. In multiple cases, and many more than one would suppose in terms of any order of social regularity, you will see the parent take a piece of food, put the piece of food into the child's hand, and then extend the child's hand to feed the elephant. And I think we'll see this now. You notice the hand going out, holding it. Also notice that occurred only in one zoo in the entire trip around the world, and we have never seen it in the American community. In repetitive sequences, every time the Frenchman fed, he wiped his hands. He shook his hands, acted as though it was dirty, and cleaned them off. We see that with that child. Receptoscope permits us a degree of control. Notice the putting the food into the hand. Notice right over behind it, another one is doing the same thing. Precisely the same operation. We move next to Rome. And in Rome, the thing that I want you to watch, you will see that the parents and the children feed themselves and the animals. This is constant. There is a constant self-feeding and animal feeding that takes place. Notice father chewing. Notice the lady down there feeding herself. Notice him feeding himself. She's feeding herself. Kid feeding himself. Feeding the elephant, kid feeding himself, father feeds himself, feed the elephant, child feeds himself, father chews. Now, whoa, hold it. This scene I kept in because of its very great beauty, and because here you have a very different thing than we saw in Britain. And in London, we saw the father involved with the animal in a peer-like give and take, including a bow to the animal at the end of their joint communion. In the Italian situation, I want you to watch closely because of the high body identification on the part of the children and the nursemaid in relating to the elephant and getting the elephant involved with them. This is a very different order of communicative relationship. Again, only in Italy did we see this to this extent and to this direction. Please go ahead. Notice she's feeding herself at the same time. Now, the trunk up, demanding the trunk, in this position. Again. I want you to watch this little boy. I hope you saw the beautiful pelvic thrust that the Italian girl rewarded the little boy with, in which she rolled her body backward and thrust her pubic region forward in absolute and complete and beautiful delight. Should we go backward and pick up one pelvic thrust? Look. All right, forward. We're going now.
Okay, we'll stop it there. So, and you can hear it. It's a recording of him giving this lecture, and you can hear the people in the audience who were laughing at different moments. So, so what do you think of this more kind of humorous mode of voiceover guiding us through? Is that ever okay, do you think, or is that always going to be problematic? Are there situations where that's okay? The fact that these are Europeans, and so that's okay to point out these things. But even if you find that to be problematic, but still, I want you to discuss: is there something important and interesting about these kind of unspoken microcultural differences? Why would it matter how people feed elephants differently in different cultures?
I just wanted to say that I think that it's unnecessary. I mean, everything that he said, it doesn't need to be like some cultural aspect. I think it's just coincidence that the ones he filmed did that, and that it wouldn't mean that they wouldn't do it in another country, especially that close. Okay. In your groups, go ahead and talk about, though, if there were other differences, and if you could sort of scientifically show that these are that there are differences in, let's say, gestures or the distance that people are from each other when they're speaking to each other, or other things like that in terms of bodily comportment, things like that. Does it matter? Why could it matter? Can anyone make an argument for why that would be interesting and important to study? Or do you all just think that that's really not important? So maybe discuss that in groups, and maybe also this question of humor, I guess. Okay. Just for a minute.
T'as déjà un groupe ou...
Non, mais c'est bon, je vais les trahir.
Ah.
Tu vas bien?
Ouais, et toi?
Tranquille, tranquille.
Cool.
Anna, c'est ça?
Ouais.
Joli chat.
C'est un nomade.
Nomade? Je savais pas qu'ils aimaient des couleurs comme ça. T'es allé là-bas ou?
Ouais, j'ai fait guide, et d'ailleurs j'ai repensé à une scène, je bossais en tant que guide avec des francophones, et il y a une scène qui m'a vachement rappelé cette scène des éléphants. On était dans une sorte de big turtle sanctuary, c'est un sanctuaire et donc j'étais avec mon groupe et il y a une scène où il y a un petit Albanais qui en fait une sorte de fontaine où des bébés tortues sont recueillis, et donc en plein milieu il y a une bande rouge qui signifie que tu n'es pas censé t'approcher. Donc il y a un petit gosse malais qui a 6 ans qui se passe dessous, et puis il va regarder les petites tortues, et à ce moment-là tu as des Français qui discutent avec moi et qui commentent. Tu vois, comme ils sont mal élevés, machin, parce que bien évidemment ils sont racistes, comme la plupart du monde.
Ils sont racistes.
Ils vont voir comment ils voilà, comment on dit, les pauvres, comme ça, ils peuvent
ça va.
Oui, bien sûr. Ouais, enfin, non, la Syrie, ça allait bien aussi avant la guerre. Ouais. Et donc après, donc ils commencent, ils élèvent pas bien leurs enfants parce que c'est pas la première fois que voilà. Et 2 minutes plus tard, il y a des Français de ce même groupe qui arrivent, des adultes, et qui font la même chose. Et en plus, ils prennent des selfies avec les bébés tortues. C'était une belle scène en fait. Et bon, en fait, la différence culturelle que je voulais parler, c'est que les Français, en fait, alors, tu sais comment ça se passe. En fait, au moins, la différence, c'est que il laisse les enfants comprendre les règles de la société par eux-mêmes en fonction des réactions de la société. Tu vois, quand le gosse il fait ça, ils vont pas forcément lui dire t'as pas de dessert aujourd'hui, ils vont juste laisser en fait l'enfant comprendre que les gens réagissent pas très bien, donc l'enfant tout seul, voilà. Bref,
pour moi, on a vu, c'est...
J'ai pas vu la première partie.
Non, mais il y avait aucune valeur en termes de documentation. T'apprends rien. Le mec, c'est un peu... Ouais, le mec, c'est un chemin. C'est un peu un mec qui fait un vlog, tu vois. Alors, pour moi, ça m'a rappelé ça. La seule partie qui était intéressante, c'est les mains. Avec les toucher. Je trouvais ça intéressant. Mais c'est le seul truc, je trouve qu'il y a une valeur. Et donc sans plus, tu vois, je ne veux même pas critiquer. Alors moi, je suis même plus intéressé en moi. Pour être vite là-bas, t'as dû travailler là-bas en fait.
En tout, j'ai passé genre 3-4 mois, pas très longtemps en fait. C'est ce que j'avais dit. Je bossais dans Croatie. Et dans un de nos groupes, il y avait une Française qui avait une agence à Oman, ils avaient besoin de photographes, etc.
Let's talk together and then we can move on to observation and sensory. Okay, so first, this question of a kind of a humorous voice. Did you have ideas for when? I mean, I think that by playing, especially the Italian woman and the way that he's poking fun at her, maybe felt like the meanest in some way to me. Did you?
I think it felt just kind of very like it felt very out of place. Like in the context, like it felt very like, why is he talking about this? Like, you know.
Yeah, okay. And the fact that he's like slowing it down and doing a replay of it.
Yeah.
What about at the beginning where he's kind of poking fun at the English father? Did it feel more okay? Because he's a patriarchal figure, so he's like a figure of power, so it's maybe, does it feel more okay to maybe be poking fun at him than?
For me, it was maybe I'm nitpicking now, but the fact that he said she gave a pelvic thrust, and when he replayed, that's the last thing I would say. I would say she bent her knees, or she leaned, or she, and the fact that he's for some reason so focused on her pelvic thrust just makes it so out of place.
Right, he's sexualizing her, and so he's kind of imposing his kind of male sexualizing gaze upon a scene that's also between a babysitter and children. Also, is something that I think can make us all uncomfortable. And we know that because he says that he's acting as a decoy. So from what we can tell, he didn't have anyone's permission even to be shooting this. They didn't know that they were being filmed, and now they're. I mean, from what I understand from that first scene where he says, "Oh, I'm acting as a decoy," so that the camera. So there are these kind of ethical questions, and in addition to questions of taste, and you're pointing to like a question of the kind of like bias that he has as a presumably heterosexual male who's interpreting this behavior, right?
I have a question. Did this documentary movie was shown in the classroom, you said? At first?
So my understanding of this, and I should reread work on it, but I mean, from what we can hear, the sound is coming from some kind of a lecture where he's showing this footage. It's some kind of a public lecture, probably at a conference or something like that, and then that was recorded, and then they were put together. But it's listed always like as an actual film.
Anthropological study?
Like he was in. He was kind of interdisciplinary in terms of, so he did like communication studies. So he taught, I think, for a long time at University of Toronto, doing more kind of communication studies. But he was this sort of father of this study of kinesics, of nonverbal communication, but not the only father. I mean, there are other people who were involved with that. So it's something that people like Gregory Bateson were interested in. Irving Goffman, who's a famous sociologist who writes about kind of everyday performance in everyday life and other things like that, was a student of his who then wrote about nonverbal communication in other ways. But yeah.
But this one felt like he's a showman. There was no really documentary value, anthropological value to it, except for one point which was the hand of the French always wiping after feeding the animal. This was the only thing I was like reflecting upon. But also at the same time he focuses more on his joke. He missed some important points. For example, in the French zoo, how the public are like all crowded together, and this kind of, for me, is important to point out because you are like from Paris to Rome, so it's interesting. So there is like this dissonance between information and showman, being a showman. So yeah.
Okay. Excuse me, do we know the sample of these cases, or was it just random? I come to the zoo and I film a panel.
What do you mean by the?
Like the number of cases.
Oh, I don't know. No, I don't know how many at each zoo they tried to get before they made these. Yeah.
Several, but how many?
Yeah.
2, 3, or 30.
Right. Yeah. No, that I don't know.
That would make a difference.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But I mean, I think that something that comes out that we can see from doing this kind of comparative approach is because you get so focused on trying to show the differences across cultures that what you do is you make an argument that assumes, and I think this is something that you were getting at, assumes a sort of uniformity of each culture. So it ends up kind of essentializing each culture in order to show how each one is different rather than making room for some kind of internal diversity, right? Except for in India, where he finds it to be too messy. But yeah.
Yeah, to me it felt a bit like, I think you also mentioned to you it felt like a vlog. To me it felt like I don't know, the equivalent of a TikTok with just like the comment of a random, YouTuber. And it didn't feel anthropological at all.
Okay.
And I don't know, he didn't like look into the infrastructure of the zoos, the environment, how that would narrow down the possible interactions of people with the animals or between themselves. I mean, there were so many things that were kind of overseen. And I think other than that, I mean, there's definitely value in, looking at, which I guess he was kind of trying to do, like cultural embodiment. I don't know, like whatever Ruth Benedict, I think, did some with the Japanese to help the military, but other than that, it was kind of like one of the first, I think, kind of valuable contributions in that sense. But I mean, there was this question, I'm sorry I missed the first part, but there was this question like, is anthropology a science, I think? I don't know, we probably discussed this already, but I feel like, I mean, I'm an anthropologist, I don't see anthropology as a science, because you can, as long as there's like an inner like coherency to the argument, I feel like it works either way. You know, you can make your case for either way, and this is one of the examples. It would be interesting to know what was his like stated purpose for doing this. Like what was he trying to prove? But yeah, I mean, there are several examples in anthropology where this is like an extreme of like uselessness. Yeah, there are several where there are coherent arguments and the methodology is much better, and still because of several, you know, desirability biases, like, I don't know, the Samoa, what was it, from Margaret Mead, right? That study where she looked at sexuality of adolescents, and then 10 years later you get like completely different outlook from a different anthropologist, etc. So yeah, I don't know. Do you know what his stated purpose was for this?
Well, I mean, his general goal was to call our attention to I think something that you mentioned is kind of the way that culture is embodied. So it's not just about a set of rules and rituals and okay, now we pray, or it's this holiday and now we're going to do this thing. But the fact that, and this is something that, you know, Marcel Mauss wrote about really early on, the fact that, you know, people swim differently in different cultures, so that there are things that we take for granted as being natural, like the ways in which we comport ourselves in our everyday lives, the ways that we hold our bodies, that are actually subtly learned from watching others. And I mean, I think that kind of, so he's interested in studying that in a way that you know, he's trying to make that into a kind of science. And I think that, you know, this is an example of something where he's trying to do it in a way that is super didactic, where we're supposed to see this on film, and it's not necessarily completely successful in the sense that he's not someone who's super well known, but at the same time there are others who picked up on other issues of unspoken rules of interaction, like Goffman, that were part of the same milieu, that were more successful, that do convince people, right? And I think that even in gender studies, somebody like Judith Butler, some of her arguments that she's making about gender as a performance are also along the same lines, this idea that there are ways in which we comport ourselves, that we think this is what it is to be feminine, to be a woman, that are always kind of citing somebody else. So pointing out that that's not this kind of natural thing that's in our DNA, but that is something that is cultural. So I think he's trying to get at that in like a very kind of particular sort of, because a pseudoscientific way through this.
The University of Toronto should really filter out their academics. I'm referring to Jordan Peterson alone. Okay.
Well, that's a comparison.
Well, they're both apparently from the University of Toronto.
Yeah. But there are some very good people in Toronto as well.
Every faculty has a few rotten apples, I think.
But I want us to keep going. But I think something else that something related to what Amar was saying about sort of if we took away the voiceover, and just looked at the material, that there is perhaps some potential in the material itself. And this is something that I think we'll get at more when we get to the observational mode. So and it's this idea of excess. That so people like David and Judith McDougall, who are associated with this observational mode, they're really interested in taking away that voiceover, taking away that overt interpretation, and putting us in a place and spending time, unlike the more fictional modes where a lot is manipulated, spending time being in that place and using the benefit of having developed close relationships with people, and waiting for that sort of feeling of what it's like to live in that community to come out. So there's still this idea that there is something that film can do that you can't do when writing about it. but it's not trying to be objective in the same way that we see these first films being, but rather is working to show the camera in its subjective positionality. And what that means a lot of times is long shots where you sort of feel the camera where it is sitting there. You get kind of a sense of that. And so I'll give a clip of one of their films. So he started filming in the early 70s and is still filming today. Or the most recent ones I've seen are from the early to mid 2000s. And they're now based in Australia, and this is one of their films about 3 generations of Aboriginal men who are returning to their original land to try to work basically as cowboys. So they have this experience working as cowboys, and they're trying to make this this work in this setting. So we'll spend a few minutes watching that. You can sort of see the difference when we don't have this overt narration. But you can also think about, okay, how much time would we need to spend where we're watching and we're not given a lot of information about the context. How much time would we have to spend watching and listening to sort of have a feeling that of being a part of this community, or what it's like to be in this community.
Hello. They used to call this place Awakening. It's lagoon. Our old people, our great-great-grandfathers used to stay in this place. After when the people went away from me, where nobody was here, well they had a station here. They call this place Tea Tree Inn at times.
Tea Tree, 80 kilometres south of Arakoon, northern Queensland. Tea Tree was operated as a cattle outstation of Arakoon Mission from 1966 to 1975. Since then, Aboriginal people whose families came from this area have been returning here from Arakoon to live in their traditional clan country. Building a settlement at Tea Tree is not easy. Supplies are difficult to obtain. The population fluctuates as people come and go. The proportion of children is high. And as yet the people have only a 50-year lease to land they consider their own.
Tea Tree standing by, over.
Eric, I can very faintly hear you there, very faintly hear you. I think maybe you've still got a flat battery. I'll tell you what's happening this morning though. Air Club should be coming down this morning. I'll send a few stores on the first plane, a couple of passengers coming down, over out to Tea Tree.
you going to tell me? Well, nothing you know, I mean, that what, from flowers, no fire.
Okay. So I want you to discuss together. Discuss just for a minute. How is this different from other films that we've seen? And I think there's a way in which when we see this observational mode, it's easy for us to think about it, sort of identify that as being somehow a kind of classic type of ethnographic film, and yet when this emerged, it was seen as being kind of path-breaking and radically different. And so I think discuss like to what extent what new seems to be happening here with this mode, what's new and different about it, and is there potential to continue to experiment with this mode without doing lots of voiceover or lots of fictionalizing? Does that make sense? Yeah? Okay. Does that make sense?
C'est international, les chars d'Orman, Made in China.
C'est plutôt vers l'Est.
Oui.
Comme le côté international s'exprime.
Parce qu'il y a je crois, en Europe. En général,
c'est moins rare. C'est sûrement pas aux États-Unis.
Oui, sûrement pas, mais c'est marrant. Moi, quand j'étais au Liban, il y a une énorme diaspora française, forcément.
Les Libanais, non?
Irakiens. J'ai vécu au Liban. Et là-bas, il y a les Français, quand ils sont au Liban, ils mettent le kéfir dans les céréales. Tu vois, ils s'imprègnent de la culture. Et quand ils reviennent à Paris, c'est reparti pour les jeans. C'est normal. Et toi, tu gardes ça pour ça.
Bon, j'aime bien, ouais.
C'est magnifique. Je me demandais comment vous allez faire, mais je pense que la meilleure solution, c'est d'aller à Armand.
Bah ouais, je parle. Non, mais C'est un peu une situation typiquement anthropologique comme des années 60. Tu sais, t'exprimes que t'aimerais bien avoir quelque chose, donc la personne qui se trouve en face de toi, elle a cette this urge to give it to you. Mais en fait, non.
Non, mais moi je savais pas que c'était aussi coloré là-bas.
Pas la façon dont les hommes s'habillent.
J'imagine que c'est
genre, et ça aussi, ça dépend des régions. Dès que tu vas pas dans les montagnes, c'est beaucoup plus coloré, ou après t'as les bédouins, t'as plusieurs. On n'a rien parlé.
Let's go ahead and discuss together, because I see one group looking at the board and we don't have that much time anyway. So first of all, what do you think? What could you argue is experimental about? Who could make an argument that observational film is a type of experimental film?
Well, I mean, I think experimental in the sense that like there's no kind of it's experimental like in the sort of context of what we've been watching, not just today but like in the weeks prior, that like it's kind of experiments with like just kind of not mediating the sort of action that you see on screen, right? It doesn't try to explain it to you except for like kind of like the brief sort of setup and like the brief intro at the beginning, right? But then it just kind of goes into just raw footage pretty much, but also not, since like what we discussed is that like with it kind of with like with the sense that like there's always kind of some montage going on and some kind of like selection of what to show, what not to show, like right, there's always this kind of faint idea of like, okay, you're selecting what to show, and like there's also like a different sort of I hesitate to use the word narratives, but that are like kind of like sort of present in the raw footage that you're not showing by not kind of by just selecting the footage that you want to use to kind of fill the runtime, like to kind of build the narrative that you're like.
We were commenting that just editing a film, editing footage is already experimenting with what we are going to show and what kind of exactly narrative are we going to put out about the community we are showing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I was thinking to myself while watching this that kind of like editing the movie is like a voiceless voiceover kind of thing.
Yeah.
So it almost comes down to the same thing.
It's an intervention on its own.
Right. Yeah. You have to make a lot of choices, and putting that together in a way that is that's compelling or persuasive. That is a special challenge of its own, that you don't fall back on the voice to just explain here's what happened and here's why they're doing this, or the fact that they managed to get the soundbite where they say, oh, this isn't just to play with, this is to cook, rather than some voice saying like, and now they will eat it, or just leaving it to a mystery of like, oh, weird, they're playing with snakes, right? Yeah. And I mean, something else that people like Anna Grimshaw, who's written a lot about observational cinema, an argument that she continues to make is that watching films like this that don't have this easy linear structure of a narrative imposed on it also forces particular demands on the viewer itself, and in that way it's experimental, in that it's challenging you in some way to sort of experience time and place and sound and vision in a different way than maybe we're used to when we're watching some kind of a documentary film that's a little bit faster, or where we know like what the kind of drama is. Yeah?
This reminded me of a fiction actually, which is called Walkabout, also in Australia, which is also a movie showcasing the interaction between like the white people of Australia who got lost in the desert and are now being held by one native Australian. And the movie itself is really has a lot of the same structure as what we see. And for me, it's interesting to ask the question of what does like visual experience have more than another format, such as reading or audio. Why would we choose? Why would we choose to use this format? So yeah.
That doesn't McDougall, not always, but like he makes the film, but also writes about it. So kind of wants to have both of those things, not just the visual.
Yeah, he's somebody who writes and theorizes a lot about what he's doing, as opposed to, I wouldn't say some of the people from the kind of sensory ethnography lab that I want us to talk about last, people like Lucien Castaigne-Taylor, who, you know, he has written theoretical works, but at this point he's sort of making this argument that he's not interested in writing anymore, and so there's a bit more of this with sensory ethnography. It's taking some of the ideas, I think, from observational film and pushing them even further in terms of this kind of rejection of language, and that what film should be doing are, you know, thinking about all of the things that text can't do is what we should be trying to do with our films. And again, as I mentioned in the first week, films like Leviathan and Sweetgrass, there are humans in them because it's about fishing and shepherding, but there's this kind of decentering of the human, so we have a kind of minima of dialogue within the films, and we spend a lot of time with the animals themselves and trying just to they're trying to sort of give us this idea of like what it's like to be on a fishing boat, to the extent that has anybody seen Leviathan or parts of it? How did you feel watching it?
Well, obviously it's very different from usual ethnographic, because it's just mainly watching the water and how the fishermen are coping on the boat, but there's minimal conversation, dialogue, and it's just kind of feels like you're there experiencing also, you know, so
yeah. I mean, I felt sick watching it. I couldn't watch most of it because
wow.
Yeah. We're gonna watch a clip from another film that is not in that extreme of a mode, but is also, you know, identifies itself as being in this kind of sensory mode, and so watch it and pay attention to how are different sensory experiences being evoked as we're watching some of these first scenes. Okay. Based on these first few scenes that are in totally different contexts, right? What is this film about, from what you can tell? Without any explanation.
Probably about the fashion industry, isn't it?
Okay. Anybody else have?
Textile, wool.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So it's about alpaca wool, basically, right? And she's not telling us this, right? That, but she's showing us this wool in very different contexts, from when it's still on the alpacas themselves to starting with when the women are weaving it, and then in this kind of final setting of the fashion show, right? To what about this kind of sensory aspect of the film? She's somebody who identifies as doing sensory ethnography. In what ways were different senses sort of activated for you in different ways at different moments?
Well, I think definitely hearing, because of sort of the alpaca, the natural calls or whatever, and then kind of you get the sort of, when it comes to the fashion show, you get the more kind of visual element, with just being bombarded with saturated colors and pop and and I think the juxtaposition of that I think is effective.
Yeah, versus meditative state at the very beginning of the elderly.
With the weaving,
Okay.
Yeah, it's very sensory, the audio and the visual, it's much more aesthetically different than...
Okay, so we get these contrasts of the different sounds. And did anybody else notice something that she does kind of consistently is we hear the next scene before we see it. So we have this kind of blackout, and you hear the clicking of the needles, and it forces you to ask yourself, what's going on? What is that? And then we see it. And so I think that there's lots of interesting stuff happening. And what we see, first of all, is this close-up of the hands. And I think she's most interested in these women who are the weavers, but also them in this whole process. But she does a lot of these close-ups of the hands. And so we can think about the ways in which, by doing that, she's sort of giving us a sense of the work that they do and the kind of handiwork that they do, and the kind of value to that craftsmanship.
It's knitting, it's not weaving.
Knitting, yeah. Sorry.
Oh.
Did I say?
Yeah,
I said
you used to read that.
But I think, and so also if we think about, if the topic is this alpaca wool, which is known for being, very soft, it has these sensuous properties. and we can't actually touch it when we're watching the film, and so she has to ask herself, like, how can I help you to get as close as possible to sort of feeling that softness and warmth without being able to give it to you. So you can think about that in terms of how can film do something that maybe writing about it can't. Okay. Thanks everybody for all of that. Now we have to end here, but I would propose, if you are free, if you want to come and have a drink next door, what is the cafe called where we get the keys?
Virtuos.
Yeah, Virtuos. We can go for a drink there. We'll just pack things up and see you over there. If you have to get going, we'll see you tomorrow here at 10 a.m.
Where is it? I mean, I'll find it on Google. Yeah.
It's Virtuos. It's just basically.
I think it's around. I think it's like not around the corner, but like right next door. I think it's pretty much like.
Yeah, it's next to the cafe and the silent.